Alrighty. Good morning. I had an idea. Um, all of this stems from one idea. In late 2023, early 2024, there were some fashion trend predictors who decided that they were going to see the oust of what was referred to as the clean girl aesthetic, an aesthetic that is very associated with slick back hair and fluffy eyebrows and minimal makeup, maybe just a lip oil on the lips and some mascara. The idea of this aesthetic is that you look very put together without doing too much. Very that girl. These trend forecasters decided that due to the waning popularity of this image of almost unattainable excellency, that they were going to usher in a new aesthetic, an aesthetic which they referred to as mob wife. There was a common sentiment: clean girl is out, mob wife aesthetic is in. Well, this aesthetic is largely derived from a singular character. It is largely inspired by Carmela Soprano from The Sopranos. It involves a lot of big hair, leopard print, furs, the idea of an exuberant display of wealth. That way, there isn't as much pressure to be perfect and to be effortless, because it's clear that a lot of effort went in to make yourself look the way you do. It often is described as walking the line between classy and trashy. So I wanted to take a look at and explore what the mob wife aesthetic would look on me as I talk about the real lives of women in the mafia, and how the idea of a mob wife is, by and large, a reality, but also an incomplete idea of what women were like in the mafia and how much participation that they had in these criminal activities. In order to understand women in the mafia, we must first have a base understanding of what the mafia is. If you are my professor or TA, because I'm turning this in as a final project, you can sit through this brief explanation. If you're not, I don't know how you found this, but hi! So for our understanding and our purposes of this video essay, the mafia is an organization that originally was based out of Sicily and largely Palermo. This organization deals in information, protection, and trust. Those are the three main exports of the mafia, and they thrive in instability. Now, I'm sure we all have an idea of what a mafia man looks like. A lot of cultural depictions that are very familiar depict them as a little bit bumbling, very violent, cruel, ruling with an iron fist, but also very family focused. If anything, family is almost a grounding point. However, it tends to gloss over how the mafia had a really detrimental effect on the coherence of these families. If we look at these cultural depictions of women in the mafia, it's always a wife or a daughter. And I will say, in The Sopranos, Carmela has a lot more agency and a lot more influence than, say, Apollonia in The Gospel. She was still relegated to this position of wife. She didn't really have as much influence as the men around her. I am not as familiar with The Sopranos as I am with The Godfather, but that position was still relatively reductive. This translates to actual real-life women. There was a woman in the American Mafia in the 1950s and 60s, around the time that the first Mafia war in Italy was starting to really bubble up and become a huge conflict. And she was in the inner circle of Lucky Luciano. She was originally working in sex work and other businesses such as that, which is not too unfamiliar for women in the mafia, or women associated with the mafia, not necessarily in it, because in Italy, at least, prostitution was not illegal, solicitation was. Now, that was less the case in the United States. Prostitutes went to the mafia for protection, because that is one of their major businesses. Virginia then made her way up, but was constantly viewed as an accessory or a playmate of these mafiosi in the United States. The Times Magazine, in an article about her death, referred to her as the red-headed, free-spending playmate of the underworld, who first gained notoriety in 1947 when boyfriend Bugsy Siegel, Murder Inc.'s West Coast representative, was executed gangland style in her Beverly Hills living room. She had packed her bags and left the day prior, leading some people to speculate that she was actually involved in this hit. But throughout all of the press regarding her at the time, she was still referred to in these reductive terms as a playmate, as a girlfriend, and not really regarding her actual involvement in the mafia business. She very interestingly blends the idea of a woman in the mafia and the idea of a mafia man, and the roles of both of them throughout her experience with the mafia. Not only was she someone who played around and had all of these mob wife aesthetics, because a lot of it stems back to her very rich, lavish spending style. She was widely regarded as this socialite. She had rubbed shoulders with Hollywood elites and senators. In fact, one of the very interesting dichotomies that we see in this idea of this frivolous mafia woman, mafia associated woman, and the realities of things like the mafia idea of omertà, which reinforces a lot of silence when it comes to a lot of things, is in her testimony in the 1951 congressional hearings on organized crime. She lied on the stand for the benefit of the mafia. She also was questioned later on in tax evasion hearings, and said, well, I worked for a while. Then the men I was around gave me things. And we're not gangsters or racketeers or whatever you call these other people. The only time I ever got anything from them was going out and having fun and maybe a few presents. Which, as a cover, makes sense, because she had this reputation of being kind of ditzy, kind of out there. And there was a rumor going around that she was involved with political higher-ups who would pay her money to spend the night with her. Now, this is just a rumor. This is not necessarily founded. However, the fact that she was able to get into these positions says something. She was known to have relatively regularly gone down to Central and South American countries and seduce people down there to get a foothold in heroin, in the heroin trade, which was a new market that the mafia was expanding into, which really led to a lot of the production of violence that was going on there between the old and new guard. But because of her lavish spending and this brilliant aesthetic that she was building up for herself, she got hit with the same charges as Al Capone did. She was never thrown in jail, though. what happened with her is that she fled to Europe with her husband and son at the time, which are never really talked about that often. She seemed to be running from something, and it was often presumed that it was necessarily the U.S. government, because she was facing these charges from the U.S. government about tax evasion, and she was going to be locked up like her masculine counterpart, not necessarily counterpart, but one of her masculine peers, Al Capone, who was also in that inner circle of Lucky Luciano. But then, a few days shy of her 50th birthday, she was found dead. And the official narrative is that she had overdosed on benzos. She was known to be a bit of a partier, and that was a large reputation of hers, is that she would drink, she would do drugs, she was very involved in that scene. But Andy Edmonds, in Bugsy's Baby, The Secret Life of Mob Queen Virginia Hill, begs to differ. He believes that it was a hit and that she was aware of it, which is corroborated by the fact that leading up to her death, Virginia had been talking about revealing a secret diary to the United States government, and using that to go after some of her criminal associates. Her husband knew about this, and within a couple days of her death, went and retrieved this diary, but not beforehand, which lends credence to the theory that he knew that she was not going to live very long. This idea of women keeping journals and using it later on to bring down people that they had been attached to in the Mafia carried through after the Second Mafia Wars in Italy. These years of war and turmoil were brutally violent, to the point where they are referred to as the Years of Lead. The Second Mafia War, arguably more so. In this period of immense violence, a girl by the name of Rita Atria was growing up. She was born to a mafia family. Her father was a very well-known mafioso. When she was 11, her father was shot and killed. And later on, several years later, she turned state's witness to bring down a lot of the people who were associated with that. There is a fabulous movie depicting her experiences growing up and becoming this state's witness, and breaking these bonds of omerta that keep people silenced and keep them protecting these people in the mafia. She kept a record of her experience in diaries, one after the other. In the movie, it's depicted that she's heavily influenced by her brother in this regard, who also wants to take down the people involved with their father's death, although he turns to becoming a mafiosi, whereas she ends up working to bring down the whole system. In the very early 1990s, Rita comes forward to the police. This was after the formation of a lot of new laws that would protect people who turn state's witness rather than immediately punishing anyone mafia associated. Rita, when she did this, was only 17, which became a problem because the government would have had to sequester a minor, which was not necessarily super legal. In recounting her experiences with the Mafia, she broke a lot of family ties, specifically with her mother. The Sicilian Girl does a great job at portraying how these bonds between mother and daughter can be broken, and how violent and how heartbreaking that can be. But it also shows her mother's actual involvement and the work that she did to maintain this Mafia family. When Rita and her brother are conspiring, she has to hide it actively from her mother, because if her mother knows, then the information gets everywhere. This harkens back to a lot of gossip networks that were very prevalent in Sicily, where prior to the official formation of the organization that we know as the Mafia, knowledge is passed through these networks of women. So if the women know, they can control whether or not the men know. And so in Rita's case, it was imperative that her mom didn't know. If she could keep that from someone who is supposed to know everything about her, then she can keep it from the people who aren't. So she wrote these diaries for years, 6-ish years, and when she brought them forward, she was largely considered by the defense as some foolish young girl who, in a fit of rage, is trying to destroy these men as retribution for her father's death. Which, yes, that was originally her goal, but later on, at least within her depiction in Sicilian Girl, her goals shifted, and it was no longer about these men in particular. It was about all of the harm that the Mafia was doing. There was a woman who was brought to the stand to testify against her who kind of rocked her perception of her father, because this woman had been abused multiple times by her father, very sexually, which is not something unfamiliar to anyone who is familiar with Mafia media. A lot of the time, women in these will be treated like objects or accessories, not necessarily their own people, and is, again, truth to that. But it isn't necessarily the whole truth, because we also get this depiction of Rita's mother, who is very strong and very powerful and is used as a way to maintain this omertà, this silence, this honor, who at one point tries to keep Rita in her hometown rather than have her go out and become state's witness, because it would be dishonorable, and she would rather have her kid die than dishonor her and turn state witness. This is a huge point of vulnerability for Rita in the movie. She's very broken up about how her mother refuses to even talk to her anymore, repeating the sentiment that it would be better if Rita, were dead, rather than having done this thing. In the end, and I can't say that it's spoilers because this was a person's real life, she ends up committing suicide so that the evidence that she has brought against a large volume of mafiosi would stick. Several people who had been helping her out up until this point have been killed, she no longer has this protection of the prosecutor who had been by her side and supporting her through this whole thing. And so a large part of the rationale was, if I die, then these charges will stick, and it's no longer necessarily about Rita or her age or her follies. It's about prosecuting these men. She can almost be seen as this martyr figure, but there were so many people who were affected by these mafia wars, young, old, men, women, children, that I don't know if it necessarily makes her a martyr figure. If you want to see very raw, very impactful, and very violent images that came out of this huge conflict, I would recommend looking into the work of the photojournalist Letizia Battaglia. She captured a lot of the violence and the death and the murder and the impact that the mafia was having on Sicily and Italy at large. She put her life very much at risk so that she could capture these pictures and capture the impact of what the mafia was doing and cultural production of violence on the people at large, which really flies in the face of this code of silence, which had been enforced, because she was recording all of this murder and all of this death and all of this violence and wouldn't shut up about it, which helped reinforce other points that people like Rita were making. And then later on, Rita's sister-in-law, Pieraiello, spoke out after these testimonies that Rita was doing and reinforced this idea that women were more involved than anybody had believed up until that point. She said, a woman can make her husband do everything she wants. Wives of the mafiosi know everything. Which indicates that women had more of an involvement in the criminal enterprise than anybody had been led to believe. And in the 21st century, there began to be a shift, which Claire Longrigg researched in her book, No Questions Asked, The Secret Life of Women in the Mob. She noticed that while the men were out of action, an extraordinary transformation occurred. The women started to take over daily operations of their husband's criminal organization. Now, this was not necessarily a new phenomenon. However, the most prominent example of this was not necessarily in what would traditionally be referred to as the mafia. The Camorra was a more northernly criminal organization based more out of Naples, who tried multiple times to model themselves after the mafia, but wasn't necessarily very successful until Raffaele Cutolo. He organized a lot of the disparate Camorra groups into the Nuova Camorra Organizzazione. But for the majority of the time that he was involved in this, he was in prison. He couldn't run things on the outside. He outsourced that to his sister, Rosetta. Rosetta was known to be a very hard and very aggressive woman who held her own in this environment. Though eventually it did crumble when her brother was cut off from the communication networks that he used to have between her in the prison, between her outside of the prison and him within it. But she was still able to hold on for a little while after that had happened. What does this mean about our understanding of the Mafia? I would argue that it means a great deal. It means that despite these ideas of what qualifies as a mafiosi and what qualifies as the Mafia, a lot of it was influenced by the women who were attached to it. These women had a great deal of sway, say, and influence in a way that was disregarded largely by the government and even the Mafia. Rita Atria and Virginia Hill would not have had the potential to cause so much conflict and turmoil if they had not had access to this information that they had garnered with their Mafia ties. I think it largely goes back to that Piera quote talking about how the women know everything, they're involved in everything. And so it's important that we take a look back and we actually acknowledge the real women who were a part of or associated with the Mafia and what their experiences were like in order to get a fuller picture of the Mafia as an organization and how it affected and still affects so many people's lives. Women in the Mafia specifically is something which culturally and historically have been largely overlooked. So if we can actually pursue this, we might be able to understand how the Mafia is perpetuated in ways that aren't as necessarily super visible. I hope you enjoyed my foray into a style that I'm less familiar with and a conversation about the women who are often disregarded in service of an aesthetic. I know that this was a point of discourse on TikTok, but a lot of people were talking about personal experiences, and I wanted to take a more historical lens to it because I don't have a lot of personal experiences, but I'm just finishing up a semester's course on the Mafia specifically, and this is my final project. So thank you for watching, whoever happened to have found this video, and I hope you learned something. And if you're my professor, please give me a good grade. Please. I'll see the rest of you if you ever decide on coming back and if I ever decide on producing more content. Alrighty, bye y'all!